We still have serious differences with Iran with regard to returning to mutual compliance with the Jcpoa.
We support the negotiations that guarantee our national interests, but Iran will not tie its economy and the lives of its people to the negotiations.
Tehran and Washington weigh their options as the fate of the nuclear deal hangs in the balance, with negotiations to revive the agreement now entering the final stretch. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. The United States and Iran have held 6 rounds of indirect talks in Vienna since April in an attempt to revive the nuclear agreement known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Jcpoa, signed in 2015 by President Obama. 3 years later, President Trump unilaterally withdrew the United States from the agreement. Now, a final round of negotiations is expected to begin over the next few days, with France, Germany, the UK, Russia, and China, the other main signatories to the agreement, acting as go-betweens. The leaders of France, Germany, and China have called on all parties involved to, quote, seize the window of opportunity for an agreement. While some expect a final agreement to be announced on July 14th, the 6th year anniversary of the Jcpoa, many obstacles remain.
If Iran continues to spin ever more sophisticated centrifuges at higher degrees, if it pursues other aspects of its program that were prohibited by the Jcpoa, there will come a point, yes, where it will be very hard to return back to the standards set by the Jcpoa.
We stress that the United States should fulfill and abide by its obligations under the Iran nuclear deal. But the issues of regional influence and missiles are non-negotiable.
Now, in a few moments, I'll be joined by Dennis Ross, former special assistant to President Obama. But first, Sadegh Zibakalam, professor of political science at the University of Tehran, joins me from the Iranian capital. Professor Zibakalam, this election saw the lowest voter turnout since 1979. Half the electorate stayed home, and over 3 million people apparently turned in what seemed to be blank ballots. How important was this protest vote, and just how consequential was this election?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think it was one of the most astonishing presidential election which Iran had during the past 42 years since the revolution, as far as the low turnout was concerned. Obviously, everyone knew that hardliner would be the Iranian new president, but not even the hopeful hardliners could imagine that the number would be so low. It was so low that the regime simply could not hide it from the people. Particularly the fact that nearly 3 million people voted and went to the polling station just to register their identity, and they didn't vote for any particular candidate.
When you look back at 2017 and in the election that year, when Raisi ran, he got just 38.5% of the vote. This time, the path was literally cleared for him by the Guardian Council. There were some 600 candidates registered, I believe. In the end, only 7 were approved. Why did Khamenei, the supreme leader, decide that now was the time to elevate Raisi, to sacrifice the election's popular legitimacy in order to ensure that he actually wins?
The only logical guess is that the supreme leader knew that during the coming 4 years, it is possible that someone might to replace him as a result of his death, or for some other reason, illness or whatever. the system might need a new supreme leader. So Ayatollah Khamenei wanted to make sure that everything was in order. The president was at his side. The chief justice was at his side. The speaker of Iranian parliament was at his side, because these are the three people who would be a caretaker of the supreme leader when Ayatollah Khamenei is no longer there, either physically or mentally or whatever. So I wanted to make sure that everything is okay, everything is safe, so to speak.
Safe for the future of the system. But in the meantime, some believe that only a hardliner with strong ties to the supreme leader can actually negotiate a nuclear agreement with the United States. Do you agree? Do you believe that Iran, under Raisi, is more likely to return to the Jcpoa?
I am one of those, the Iranian, who strongly believe that the previous nuclear deal did not go through, the one with Obama, simply because of the internal rivalries amongst Iranian themselves. The hardliners saw no reason why should they supported the deal that Rouhani had made. However, this time, because they themselves are in charge, they would make sure that the deal would work perfectly, and they wouldn't cause any problem for the deal.
But regardless of the dynamics, Iran had stuck to the terms of the agreement. But do you believe that now it can afford to play hardball in these negotiations that are going on? Can it keep the status quo, the US sanctions in place, or will it have to make some short-term nuclear concessions for long-term economic relief?
I believe that I split it, the future agreement with Biden administration. I split it into two sections. The short-term part of it and the long-term part of it. The short-term part of it is Iran would have some of her assets that have been frozen as a result of the sanctions, and United States would make sure that Iran is behaving properly as far as her nuclear agreement is concerned. This is the short-term agreement. Both United States wants it and Iranian want that deal as well. However, the problem lies ahead for the long-term negotiation, because United States wants Iranian to control their missile agreement, their military presence in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen and other parts of the Middle East. And Iran simply says, no, it's nothing to do with United States. The fact that our nuclear program, our missile program, or the fact that we are in Syria or not, it has nothing to do with the United States. That is the most difficult part of the negotiation, would be in future.
All right, Professor Sadegh Zibakalam joining us from Tehran. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That was the view from Tehran. So how is Raisi's victory being seen here in the United States? Did Washington's so-called maximum pressure policy embolden Iran's hardliners and make diplomacy between the US and Iran even more difficult? I'm joined by Dennis Ross, Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and former Special Assistant to President Obama. Ambassador Ross, you said on the eve of the election in Iran that whoever wins will make very little difference. In fact, you said it's going to be a more hardline government than we've seen. But isn't the rise of Raisi in many respects a result of the policy that the United States has pursued for the last few years?
I really don't think so. I think the rise of Raisi reflects what the Supreme Leader wants. The Supreme Leader, I think, is positioning Iran for a future without him. And I think he wanted to install a president who reflects his attitudes, both in terms of the essence of the Islamic Republic, not liberalizing it in any sense, not minimizing its confrontation, certainly with the United States and others, seeking to preserve, I think, ties maybe to the East, preserving very strict internal controls, preventing any kind of intrusion of real foreign influence I think all of this,
Well, that
yeah, I think all of this,
that may very well be the case, Ambassador, but wouldn't you agree that the so-called hardliners' position was strengthened by the failed policies that the United States has pursued, the fact that the US withdrew from an international agreement unilaterally and not just failed to remove any sanctions, but imposed hundreds of new sanctions on the Iranians?
look, I have no doubt that for the hard line in Iran, the American withdrawal from the JCPOA was a boon. They clearly used it to say to the pragmatists or the more moderate reformers, your way didn't work, our way is the only way. The Supreme Leader throughout was always critical of the JCPOA. Now, he clearly decided to acquiesce and allow it, and clearly he did allow it because he wanted sanctions relief. So they got sanctions relief for a while, and then they not only saw the end of sanctions relief, but they saw the imposition of much heavier sanctions, much wider.
But wouldn't you admit that the U.S. way didn't work either? Because I know you've been advocating for many years now a harsh, coercive approach with Iran. You said the U.S. should set the stage for the use of military force if diplomacy fails, and that there should be verifiable, strict enforcement of restrictions on their nuclear program. But isn't that part of it, what the JCPOA was doing, verifying that the Iranians were complying with their obligations?
Yeah, I was not in favor of pulling out of the JCPOA. I thought it was a mistake to pull out of the JCPOA. So,
but you believe that it didn't go far enough, because in a piece that you recently co-wrote, Ambassador Dennis, you say that it's very well and good for the Biden administration to want to return to the agreement, but that it should also look to move ahead, make it longer and stronger.
Well, that's the policy of the Biden administration. The Biden administration has, and the president said this when he was running in the campaign, he wanted a longer and stronger agreement, and there's a reason for that. In 2030, all of the restrictions on the size of the Iranian nuclear program, on the numbers of centrifuges, the quality of centrifuges, on the amount of enriched material, in 2030, when the JCPOA lapses, Iran is permitted to produce weapons-grade material and no limitations on that. So the Biden administration is saying they want a longer and stronger agreement. I've looked at, okay, what will it take to be able to produce that? You will not induce the Iranians into responding to that. They will have to see that there's a consequence of not doing it. Now, obviously, you have to leave them a way out. And I don't believe in putting them in the corner in a way that in a sense it guarantees that they're going to lash out. But I do think they want to be in a position where they have the option to have a nuclear weapon. And we want to be in a position where that's not the case.
And that was being verified through the IAEA and the JCPOA. In fact, they were enriching uranium to 3.7%, which is what was allowed under the agreement well after the U.S. pulled itself out of the agreement. It seems to many looking at this that the United States is trying to shift the goalposts. Here you have the IAEA repeatedly certifying that Iran had been fulfilling its obligations. All the other major parties, China, Russia, France, the UK, Germany, are all okay with this agreement. Why aren't they looking to make it stronger and bigger?
Well, first of all, the Europeans have made it clear that they do favor longer and stronger. You had Macron, even during the Trump administration, saying, look, we need a follow-on agreement to this. The issues you're raising relate to the JCPOA, but they don't deal with what I just mentioned. In the year 2030, Iran can have as large a nuclear infrastructure and industrial base as they want. They can produce as much fissile material, and indeed at a weapons grade, as they want. They are not prevented from doing that. They are not prevented after the year 2030 from being in a position where they can have a threshold nuclear weapon status where they could confront the world with a fait accompli. That's why you need.
But that's the agreement that the United States agreed to. That's the agreement that you negotiated. You can't simply breach an international agreement. I mean, the JCPOA is also a UN Security Council resolution, as you know, Ambassador, which is binding. It doesn't have a withdrawal clause. You can't then dictate the terms of those who are still in it while you choose to violate the agreement.
Your point is fair that this is what was agreed. But it is also, if you go back and you ask anybody who negotiated on the American side, they assumed that before you got to 2030, there would have to be follow-on discussions, because the reality of what happens in 2030 is Iran will be a nuclear threshold weapon state. Prior to the JCPOA, Iran was cheating all the time. One of the Ali Hananen, who was an inspector for the IAEA, said prior to the JCPOA, if Iran doesn't cheat on this, it'll be the first time in 25 years it hasn't cheated.
But you seem to be conveniently forgetting that the Iranians fulfilled their part of the agreement way after the U.S. pulled out. And as a result of the U.S. pulling out, of course, they now have gone ahead and are enriching at higher levels, as you mentioned. But let me ask you this, Ambassador.
Sure.
In a piece you recently co-wrote in The Atlantic, you said that for many in the region, the lesson was obvious. There is no way to build trust with Iran because Iran has an agenda to dominate the Middle East. Isn't that ironic? If anyone has a trust deficit, isn't it the U.S.?
Well, the U.S., with some may have that, but I think we have a different administration from the Trump administration, number one. Number two, go ask almost anybody in the region if they trust the Iranians.
What about the destabilizing
and
belligerent activities of the U.S.'s two other close allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia?
It's an interesting focus that you have. You know, let me answer it in this way. One of the reasons I take the view of the Iranians that I do is that when I was our lead negotiator between Arabs and Israelis and Palestinians in the 1990s, the Iranians, even when they had a government led by Khatami, the Revolutionary Guard was in fact carrying out efforts to produce bombings, terror attacks. Same time that you had a president who actually believed in what he called the dialogue between civilizations. And at the same time, what was the Revolutionary Guard trying to do? Trying to subvert an effort to negotiate peace by having constant suicide bombings. So, you know, there's a legacy here, and that one shouldn't.
But Ambassador, it's a selective reading of history, isn't it? Because the Israelis are also widely believed to be behind recent attacks against Iran's nuclear facilities. There are never any consequences for these actions. In fact, quite the opposite. The U.S. continues to support Israel politically and militarily, and not to mention Saudi Arabia as well, for years getting the implicit, if not active support of Saudi Arabia, getting the active support of the United States in its war in Yemen. Shouldn't you have the same yardstick by which you actually judge all of these countries in the region? Why single out Iran's quote-unquote malign activities when there's plenty to criticize Saudi Arabia and Israel on?
Because their malign activities have been quite consistent. They export militias. That's what they do. They don't export good governance because they don't have it. They export militias.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Ambassador Dennis Ross, thank you so much for making the time.
Glad to be with you.
Meanwhile, President Biden's decision to launch airstrikes against suspected Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria late last month has triggered a strong reaction on Capitol Hill, with some leading Democrats accusing the president of acting without proper congressional authorization. One of Biden's closest allies in the Senate described the airstrikes as a low-intensity war that would require Congress's approval. Last month, the House passed legislation with a large bipartisan majority to repeal the authorization for use of military force in Iraq that Congress approved in 2002 and under which the Biden administration justified its recent airstrikes against targets in Syria and Iraq. Now, more than 30 progressive organizations here in the U.S. have been warning the White House about the risks of escalation between, quote, the United States and reported Iranian proxies in Syria and Iraq, saying it only shows how urgently needed a new course of action is. I'm now joined by Joe Cirincione, Distinguished Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, one of the organizations that signed the letter. He previously served as president of the Plowshares Fund, a global security foundation. Joe Cirincione, you are one of those who warned President Biden early on in his administration against delaying the nuclear talks that are going on in Vienna since April. You urged him to rejoin the Jcpoa because of the elections in Iran and the shifting dynamics there. He announced on day one that the United States was going to rejoin the Paris Agreement and WHO. Should he have done the same with the Jcpoa? Was it a mistake not to?
Absolutely. We could see this coming months ago, that if he delayed, he would run up into the June presidential elections in Iran, and that could greatly complicate the talks, and that's exactly what's happened now. But the Biden administration sort of had an own goal here. There was a vigorous debate inside between those who wanted to return to the JCPOA quickly and efficiently. We probably could have had it done by now if they had done so, and those who wanted to use the Trump sanctions as leverage to try to get Iranian concessions. Those leverage people won in the early weeks and days, and it cost us. The leverage never amounted to anything. There are no Iranian concessions, and finally they came to their senses, returned to the talks, or started the talks up in April. But now here we are, as a result of the election of Ebrahim Raisi, we have a delay in completing the talks. This was a package that was all done, ready to go. President Rouhani expected to seal it in the end of June, but the elections intervened, politics intervened. It's given the hardliners in Tehran leverage to delay and perhaps kill the talks. I think the talks are hanging by a thread at this point.
What about the hardliners here in the United States? Because Biden campaigned on rejoining the nuclear agreement. He criticized Trump for pursuing the so-called maximum pressure policy, withdrawing from the JCPOA, and adding hundreds of sanctions on Iran. Just a month into his administration, though, he launched airstrikes in Syria. And again, just a couple of weeks ago, there were airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. Does Biden have the right strategy for Iran?
Yes, there's sort of two sets of hardliners. There are those who really oppose the deal, like Robert Menendez, the powerful chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and any delay in getting the deal gives those forces more time to put a stick in the spokes. And then there's the other, you might call them more benign hardliners within the administration, like Brett McGurk, who's the director of Middle East policy for the National Security Council, very knowledgeable, well-intentioned, but he's more focused on the battlefield in Iraq and Syria. And he's the one, I believe, behind the airstrikes before and just recently, trying to gain some military advantage on the ground. But however, these strikes greatly complicate the talks. It gives talking points to the hardliners in Tehran, saying, see, you can't trust the United States. They don't really intend to conclude a deal. And that kind of mistrust at the closing stages of negotiations could be critical. It could derail the talks.
And so when hardliners here in the US say that this agreement, and they've said that for years, isn't sufficient, it is weak, we need to change it and renegotiate it, when Iran was in full compliance, when it had been enriching uranium to a maximum of 3.7%, which was allowed under the JCPOA. It did so for a full year after the US withdrew. When that happens, what is the next move? I mean, should sanctions be lifted by the United States, since they are the ones to have violated this agreement?
Yeah, I've been working on nuclear policy here in Washington, D.C. for almost 40 years, and I can tell you this is the strongest agreement I've ever seen on nonproliferation. This deal worked. It shrank Iran's program to a fraction of its original size, locked it in a box, froze it for a generation, and put it under the most stringent inspection regime on the planet. Now, it didn't take care of everything, and that's one of the arguments the hardliners now use, so the so-called unicorn strategy. Go chase the ideal agreement, the better deal that somehow is just around the corner if we had the political will to grasp it. That's what Trump said. So he's pulled out of the deal. He put on this maximum pressure strategy, which was a complete failure. It didn't deter Iran. Iran's presence in the region is stronger. Iran's program went ahead full steam now. They're now closer to the ability to build a bomb now than they were before the deal was reached. So that backfired. The steps are clear. Return to the deal. The U.S. come back in compliance, lift the sanctions that Trump imposed, lift the sanctions that he reimposed. Iran comes back into compliance, remove the centrifuges, get rid of the stockpiles of uranium gas, and then use that as a building block, a foundation for other agreements that could address Iran's behavior in the region, U.S. behavior in the region, and the issues of militia groups that Iran backs. All those could be put on the table, but you need to get back to the JCPOA first. There's no shortcut around return to the deal.
All right, Joe Cirincione, good to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Ghida.
It should have been relatively easy and straightforward for the Biden administration and Iran to resuscitate the JCPOA painstakingly negotiated under the Obama administration when Biden was vice president. After all, Trump's withdrawal from the agreement, a euphemism for unilateral violation, while Iran was still in full compliance, has been decried by the JCPOA's other signatories, including Washington's close allies, as well as the IAEA, the true certifier of Iran's nuclear undertakings. But relations between Washington and Tehran are anything but easy or straightforward. Ultimately, both need, above all, to save face, and for now both sides are playing hardball. And so, in short, while the window is closing fast, it is an open question whether or not the US will rejoin the nuclear deal. But the impact of the Vienna talks goes far beyond that. Iran's reportedly unmet diplomatic assurances that the next US administration will not, yet again, denounce the agreement begs the question: what is the value of America's word if it can rescind, on a whim, formal accords entered into with other nations, not to mention the impact on the stability of an already volatile Middle East region? That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry. Send me your thoughts and comments from the entire team in Washington. Thanks for watching.